introduce Ken Perlin, and the way I'm going to introduce Ken Perlin is just to read, because there's so much, and I couldn't commit it to memory. But I do want to say that every term when I teach lighting and materials in Maya, I ask my students, why do you think that shader is called the blend shader, and why do you think that noise function is called the Perlin noise function? And then I show them the picture I took of Jim Blend and Ken at a Pioneers gathering a few years ago. And I tell them, these are real people, and they're still alive and kicking. So Ken Perlin is a professor of computer science at NYU and directs the Future Reality Lab. His research includes future reality, computer graphics, animation, user interfaces, and education. He's chief scientist at Parallax and Tectonic Technologies, an advisor for High Fidelity, a member of the SIGGRAPH Academy, and a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors. He received an Academy Award for technical achievement for his noise and turbulence procedural texturing techniques, which are widely used in feature films and computer games. I know this to be true. His honors also include the 2020 New York Visual Effects Society Empire Award, the 2008 ACMSIGGRAPH Achievement Award, the Trapcode Award for Achievement in CGI Research, the NYC Mayor's Award for Excellence in Science and Technology, the Sokol Award for Outstanding Science Faculty at NYU, and a Presidential Young Investigator Award from the National Science Foundation. He was a general chair of the UIST 2010 conference and has been a featured artist at the Whitney Museum of American Art. He received his Ph.D. in computer science from NYU and a BA in theoretical mathematics from Harvard. This guy's kind of smart. Before working at NYU, he was head of software development at R. Greenberg Associates, and before that, the system architect at Magi, where he worked on seminal computer animation sequences from the film Tron. So I'm going to have to plug his box in, but let me introduce to you Ken Perlin. Thank you, NVIDIA.
All right. Hello. I'm impressed by that guy. I would like that. Yeah, so it's enormous honor here, of course. I'm very flattered that you asked me. I've been trying in this group to sort of, while I'm standing here, to calibrate, like, what does it mean? Where am I? Pioneer. And I walked in here and I've been walking around at SIGGRAPH like, 1981. I'm all that. And then I run into Dave Kasich in 1974. and then you go the other way. Like, I brought my Tron shirt from 1982 when they gave it to us when we worked on the movie, and it really doesn't fit. All right, so I want to basically talk about my personal journey, and I was trying to figure out where to start. I'm going to label this in 3 parts. The first part is called Days of Future Past. So this is me as a kid. Okay, good. All right. This is me as a kid. When I was a kid, I was conflicted. As many of you probably were in this room, because I wanted things that had to do with art. I was really interested in things that were beautiful and aesthetic, and I also really was into technology and making things and how does it work. And this was a constant struggle because I was told by everybody that you have to choose. It's like, are you one of these right-brain people or one of these left-brain people? Which are you? And this happened very, very early in my life. And so I kept looking for ways out of this dilemma, looking for influences that would help me. One thing that absolutely was not a conflict for me was that I liked dinosaurs. and for me, interesting that right from the beginning, dinosaurs were virtual reality. And dinosaur virtual reality because you have your plastic dinosaurs. How many people here had plastic dinosaurs? There you go.
I still do.
Yeah, and you pick them up and you take them on adventures, you know, the T-Rex and the Brontosaurus. I love the Brontosaurus more than the others because when I was a kid, they believed that the Brontosaurus had never existed. You know, there was that whole thing for a while, the Brontosaurus never existed, so I thought it was great because it was like more extinct than the others. And the thing is, when you're a little kid, you can do anything with pieces of plastic. Like, you know, it's limited only by your imagination, and kids have infinite imagination. And then as I got a little older, I discovered how the purple crayon. And I thought, okay, that's who I want to be. I want that purple. In fact, I'm wearing purple today. I want that purple crayon. I want to be able to just make things by thinking of them. And, you know, when you're a little kid, you're like, you believe this is possible. And then I turned 16. I snuck outside out of the sleepaway camp upstate New York where I was a counselor without telling anybody and watched this movie, Fantasia, the good one. And I was just amazed because here were people clearly who were doing art with technology. Yes, they had done it back in 1940. If I wanted to do it, I would have to do it differently, but it really spoke to me. It was like, okay, I can get what's going on here, and they're dinosaur proof. So I was just totally in heaven, and I was like, okay, I know what I want to do with my life. So basically, I went to college, I studied math, and I went to work for this guy right out of college. This is Phil Middleman. He founded Magi in 1966. Long before almost anybody else, he realized that computer graphics was the future, and he started hiring a bunch of really smart people to make computer graphics. And he was doing it when computers were very slow, and nobody even thought that it was a legitimate academic discipline yet. And so this is a picture I found of the crew of us. This was kind of shortly before Tron, and you know, there's that nerdy guy in the back, kind of definitely doesn't go out to clubs. And this is Chris Wedge, who went on to found Blue Sky and made the Ice Age movies, etc. So there were a lot of interesting powerhouse people in that room. And then in 1981 in Dallas, I went to my first SIGGRAPH, and this is, of course, the beautiful, beautiful color created by Kramer. Craig, where are you? Craig, there he is. Right? And I just found such a welcoming community. I mean, just three of the people that I met were, you know, Jim Lynn and Turner Whitted and Frank Crow, and I'm leaving out other people, but they totally embraced, you know, this gangly kid, this nerd. You know, they said, okay, we're going to talk to you, we're going to spend time with you, we want to hear about your algorithms, and I felt as though these people had this philosophy of paying it forward. You know, if somebody helped us when we were young, we're going to help you. And I felt like I was home. You know, this is a real community, and that has continued throughout all of the 42 years that I have been going to SIGGRAPH. And then there was this guy who, Lance Williams not only invented so many of the algorithms. I mean, we still use bitmapping now, which is amazing considering how long ago it was. But also, remember, I was one of those unpopular kids in high school. You know, I would spend my time in the library, in the computer room, and do math and stuff like that. And Lance was a very important lesson for me, because Lance showed that you could be a computer graph researcher, and you could still be the coolest guy in the room. And that was like, okay, somebody as cool as Lance. And those of you who knew Lance know that he was the coolest guy in the room. And he was from Kansas, and ever since then I love Kansas. And so I learned a lot even that first year. And then the next year, Tron came out. We got to work on it. I was in the right place at the right time. And we worked on a number of scenes, including, you know, the light cycle scenes and the game grid and a whole bunch of really interesting stuff. And I learned a lot in particular from Chris Wedge and from Richard Taylor, who was the art director on that film. I learned like how you get productions done from him, even when you're working with people who don't know how to get productions done. And then now we're going to travel by map. The next thing that happened was Disney, of course this was a Disney film, put me on an airplane and sent me from Elmsford, New York, up in Westchester, to Southern California, because I said, okay, pick somebody who's writing algorithms there, and we're going to send him out and meet with this guy. And so they put us in a room and said, okay, Ken, John, talk, figure out what you want to do, we'll make a budget. And so, so we did this, which was, some of you have seen it. It was a test for Where the Wild Things Are, the great Maurice Sendak classic. And a lot of people came together to make this. Chris Wedge did the 3D animated background. He did the modeling. I wrote some special lighting algorithms to try to make it look like a storybook. You know, you break the rules of physics to make it look like a storybook. And John directed it. Glenn Keane did the animation. And it was a test to see whether, this was really the first time anyone had said, okay, we have 2D traditional animation and we have 3D computer graphics, how do we make them work together? And one of the things that we were trying to avoid was the sense of flat things slapped onto round things. So we needed to figure out how to make it look round and airbrushed, but it really was 2D art. And it was people doing line drawing. So we set up a rotoscoping system so that the people who were doing the, Glenn, for example, could just draw in 2D. And all he was ever going to draw was lines. And so I had to come up with some way to make this work, to not just match the colors, but make things look rounded. So if you imagine the picture on the left is sort of representation of what he drew, and Christine Chang at Magi wrote a paint system so we could fill in the colors, but that still didn't give you the 3D look. So I happened to have worked on an algorithm that was a really, really, really fast way of just blurring something in one direction. So just a one-dimensional blur, super fast, very small number of operations per pixel. So once I had that, then I could blur it the other way too, and it wasn't actually quite blurry enough, so I just did it again, and then now we had a second order blur. So this was all really fast, but the problem is it doesn't look like airbrushing, it looks like somebody's got bad eyesight. So how do you make the edges? So what you could do is you can take the original silhouette and you can silhouette it, but now it looks dark around the outside. So what I realized was going on was that the kernel of the blur was bleeding in from the black areas, and I needed to undo that. And the way to undo that was to take the original silhouette, blur it the same way, and then divide by that. And then that just accounts for the area under the blur is just the area inside. And then you can slap that on top of any background, and now you've got things that look airbrushed, and Glenn Keane can just do his artwork and everything flows. And we created a whole production pipeline for this. And this test rolled around and got seen by a number of people in the industry. And a friend of mine who worked with Robert Zemeckis said that he saw it, and that it was part of the reason that he decided to go ahead with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which uses different techniques, but is kind of trying for the same sort of two worlds together feel. And then John Lasseter told me that he took the test for Wild Things in his hand, and that's what he brought with him when he decided to jump ship from Disney and go work for Pixar, which apparently worked for him. So I was reacting against the fact that Tron looked like it was made on a computer. I mean, it was wonderful to work, but I didn't want graphics to become pigeonholed as it's stuff that looks like it came from a computer. So that's why I made the procedural noise function, which you all know about, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. But I'm going to talk about some other things around it, which is in 1984, SIGGRAPH 84, in Minneapolis, I gave a course, and other people in the course, I think Turner was in the course, and maybe Jim, and it was an advanced computer graphics, and I could talk about whatever I wanted. So what I had been doing over the course of late 83, early 84, was I realized that the noise function by itself wasn't going to get me enough. I needed to be able to use it in rapidly iterating ways. So in my course, I started introducing these examples. So this was in the summer of 84. And the way I made these examples was I realized I needed to write a computer programming language that I would run at every pixel. And because that gave me the flexibility to do that without having to, constantly I have to make a special case. And it was just faster once you had a language to do that. And the general idea of it was that at every pixel, the input would be a point and a normal, and then you run an arbitrary program with if statements and variables and while loops and, procedures, and you output a color. So whatever you want to do in there, you can do. You can build lighting models, etc. Now, at the same time, that SIGGRAPH, Rob Cook's great paper on shade trees came out. So there were these two different papers, people who'd been working independently, and I'd shown my thing and he was showing his thing, but they were different. And it was interesting the way they were different because he was solving a different problem. He wasn't interested at that point in building a programming language. He was making a very, very good expression parser. And the reason I think that he was focusing on that was because when you think about, and for those of you who saw Pat's talk and Ed's talk yesterday, you got this in detail. What Pixar was focusing on at the time, working for George Lucas, was they were selling a computer, and that computer was a single instruction, multiple data parallel computer. It was a SIMD pipeline computer, and if you're going to have a SIMD pipeline computer, then the only way you can get things to run really, really fast through that is if you have lockstep operations at every pixel. So what you want is a really easy way for artists to write expressions. And that optimizes for the computer that was really their business at the time. But I didn't have any production constraints. I wasn't in production. Magi was just, they didn't even know what I was working on. They're like, oh, he's making stuff that looks cool. Great, And so I didn't need things to run fast. And so a full computer program running at every pixel is a lot slower, but it also lets you do whatever you want. And frankly, I was a person who had no production responsibility, and I could just do whatever the little kid in me wanted to explore. That was my job. So basically, by the time the paper came out, and I kept working on this and kept making things, etc., I could spend lots and lots of time, and I could be the artist who, was very demanding, and I could be the programmer who had to listen to that artist and do whatever that artist said. I kept iterating, but because I had a programming language, I could go back and forth between being those two people without driving myself crazy. So, I could tune things and change the algorithm and add different lighting algorithms, et cetera, and having a programming language really, really helped with that. So if you're going to work on a team of people with different talents, try to make the team really small, and if you can get it down to one, you're good. but no smaller. Okay, so then the paper came out, and I think the reason that paper, that was now in San Francisco, SIGGRAPH 85, I think the reason that paper had an effect was everybody was looking at the algorithms and saying, what are these algorithms that are doing this? But it was really the fact that I had the flexibility to iterate on a program over and over and over again to discover the algorithms with some procedural primitives like the noise function, the turbulence function they built on top of that. And so people were responding, actually, I think, to the pictures. And that's why it had a big impact on the field, but they thought that they were responding to the algorithms. And which was good because, as Pat pointed out, computer graphics should not be hijacked by people who think it's only algorithms. So they quickly discovered that the only way to make these algorithms work was by having artists in the loop, which is the way it should be. People who know what looks good. There's no shortcut to that. And also, as a benefit, it turned out that in the long run, as Ed pointed out in his Pioneers talk yesterday, you want to focus on a multiple instruction, multiple data architecture, because if you focus on a SIMD architecture, you're spending all of your time eventually just moving data back and forth. So you want all the things to happen as much in the inner loops as possible, which turned out to be the way forward for GPUs. Now, of course, it's 40 years later, and okay, so let's see, every 10 years is a factor of 100. So in 20 years, it's 10,000, and then it's a million. So it's 100 million. So we're now 100 million times faster, according to Moore's law, and which is an approximation. But now, we're in a very different situation where, we're in a world where I can be running on my computer now in real time, and the thing that I'm running on my computer, and I'm just running this right now, while you're watching it, the thing that I'm running, so there's the vertex shader, but the fragment shader that I'm running looks pretty much like what I was writing in 1984 or 1985. It doesn't really look any different. It's just programming where you pull in, somehow you have a point and a normal, you do a bunch of stuff with noise and turbulence functions, and then you can just play, you can just change whatever you want. And as you change it, except now, instead of taking an hour a frame, it's happening in real time. But you have this freedom and this flexibility to play around and make things. And I think that is the key to our field, is that people can play, and Moore's law basically brings things more and more into the area of interactive play, which is inviting in more and more people, which is one of the reasons I think that of all the group that contributed to this, those two guys from Shader Toy were so important sociologically to our field, because they gave all these people permission to just play and have fun, which is awesome. And also, now that we had better algorithms, the most important thing is we can make better dinosaurs. Part two. Part two is called On the Threshold of a Dream. And here I'm talking about what happened when I realized that I had to go beyond my career in industry. 1986, some of you remember this, Jaron Lanier shows up with VPL, and suddenly you have multiple people wearing these VR headsets all hanging out with each other. And these people can obviously see each other as avatars. Remember, this was 1986. This isn't Mark Zuckerberg claiming it's about to happen. This is 1986. And I was really inspired by this vision of the future, and I decided I wanted to move to academia, and I finished my Ph.D., and then right as soon as I finished my Ph.D., which was at NYU, I just went and joined the faculty of NYU, and started doing research in computer graphics. So the first thing I did, there's the NYU logo, torch. So the first thing I did was make another torch using my procedural texture techniques. And my mentors were, Jack Schwartz, who is one of the great geniuses of the 20th century. He was the founder of the computer science department, a great mathematician. And interestingly enough, David Lowe is now here at UBC and has been for many years. But he, at the time, was an NYU faculty member in vision, and he insisted, when he was my thesis advisor, that I look at perception and vision and David Marr's book on vision, and really understand what it is about the human perceptual system that makes techniques like this work. Because artists don't work by replicating physics, artists work by appealing to the human perceptual system. And that was a very important lesson for me to learn. And then a few years after that, I did the hypertexture work, where I stole from myself. I took the same ideas and just put them into a volume cube and started making things that were volumetric, whether tribbles and fire and stone, and I made design galleries of different kinds of cloth, varying different things. And the cool thing is you could actually make things like, glass where the light really does go in curved paths. And all I'm doing is the same stuff, but I'm just marching through with curved rays through volumes. And then I just started playing around with other things, because in academia you could do that. I started thinking, okay, maybe I'll start playing around with, so in 1990, I started playing around with zoomable interfaces. And I started creating all these different ways. And it took years. I think the paper with my student, David Fox, we finally got it published in '93. We kept just sending it to SIGGRAPH, and it wasn't good enough. And it was Jim Kajia who said, keep sending it in. It's okay. Eventually they'll say yes. You'll wear them down. And we did. So this idea of zooming just kept, and then Ben Peterson followed up with this amazing Pad++ work, and it just kept going. And eventually people found practical uses for it. And so I did this today. I found out that if you go into Google Maps, the time it takes to walk from my lab in New York to here is 945 hours. And Google Maps can just tell you that instantly. But the trick is you have to not stop. Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. I don't know how long it is if you stop. I think that something got screwy with my display here, so I'm going to restart this program just to make sure that everything's in the right place. All right. Let's see. Am I about the right place? Yeah. Okay. Just had to skip forward. All right. So let's see. So we were here. And then in 1992, I was invited. And this is the great thing about academia. When you're in industry and someone says, oh, why don't you just spend weeks in some exotic city somewhere, you get fired. But if you're in academia, it's what you're supposed to do. It's really great. Like, yes, it's intellectual exchange. And there I met a number of great people that I ended up collaborating with, especially Luis Valio, who I still collaborate with. We did a SIGGRAPH paper very soon after we met, like within a year or two, on using procedural methods to create paint. Paint is procedural textures that you zoom in and you paint details on details, and you can make cities and all kinds of stuff. He's a really, really fascinating guy. And then the next year after that, A. Thomas Goldberg, who basically, he's a polymath who can do anything. He's now here, wandered into our lab, and we shared an interest in procedural characters. We're trying to use procedural methods to do characters, to do storytelling, and we shared this passion of, could we go from all the way the story level down through procedural character animation, down through modeling and rendering, and see if we could have characters that had the sort of AI to tell their own stories. So we had this SIGGRAPH paper in '95, where we built this whole engine for characters that make their own decisions and this sort of, and then you can author them at a high level. And then at SIGGRAPH '95, we ran our improv system on a projector that ran over the exhibition, and it just ran continuously from the first day of the conference all the way to the end. And every scene, every moment, the characters, the virtual characters, were making their own decisions, and they were improvising a story. So we didn't have to author it, we just built a system for them to author it. So basically, it's still, I think, the longest animation in history. It just ran for, so I agree with our friend from NVIDIA. You just have the machines do it and we can all go home, because AI. I think, can you just do that? Can you say, because AI? It used to be because you could say, because VR, but it doesn't work anymore. So now you have to say, because AI. So, or ML, all right. And then the next year, we did people remember Sid and the Penguins? Sid and the Penguins was a real watershed moment for us, because we came right after a Pixar piece that, I think it was Jerry's Game, that was an incredibly compute-intensive piece. So, they were talking very proudly about how many CPU hours it took to make this, frame by frame by frame, and ours was real time. So the contrast was fascinating. We're like, we're showing something at the Electronic Theater that's real time, this just running on a thing. And every time we ran it, it would be different. So, and that was the thing about it, was that it was the same general story, but the virtual actors got to make different decisions on their own. And the weirdest thing about this experience was that all the time we had been working on it back in New York City, we were playing it to the soundtrack Walkin' on the Sun by Smash Mouth, which you being pioneers, you all remember. And it was it was #1 on the Billboard charts. So the people from SIGGRAPH very politely explained to us, no, you can't play that at SIGGRAPH because you don't have the rights to it. So I wrote a letter to the record company and on official My Lab stationery, and I said, we're doing this animated piece at this technical conference and we would like permission to use this song. And we got a letter back from the record agency, some executive there saying, okay, well, it's nonprofit, blah, blah, blah. You have our permission only for the conference to use this song. And so now we had an official letter. And so every single moment of that conference, that song was played by the conference organizers. They just kept playing it like, oh, we can play it. We have a #1 song. We can play it. It's free, and we don't have to pay for it. And it was, they were so happy with us. Oh, what just happened here? Okay. And except that as soon as the conference ended, we could no longer play it. I think this thing is finding its way again, hopefully. It takes a while to connect. Yes? There we go, okay. So in 1996, things changed a lot for me because that was the year when I finally had the capability, the tools are available for me to start writing Java applets. So this was a turning point for me because it meant that I could talk to people by example. I could say, instead of trying to explain something, I could show something and just put it on the web and it would just run and they would see for themselves. And you don't have to persuade people of anything if they're playing it for themselves. So I just started making applets after applets after applets. And I was just like, this would be my, my practice, an applet a day. And I built all these tools and, but the applets started having a life of their own. You put something out in public and things happen that you just don't know what's going to happen. Like, for example, I was interested in facial animation. So I was trying to come up with a system that was simple enough to be able to convey all of these different facial expressions by just pressing buttons and animate, and it would make and you could make little stories with it. And you could show how the little notes on the bottom made the chords at the top. You could see how complex emotions are actually, and it was sort of in some sense, a very, very simplified version of Ekman's facial action coding system, but very, very simple and minimal. And this started getting really popular to my surprise, I hadn't expected this, among the community of people who have affective disorder, like people who are on the autism spectrum, and they started using it to practice to recognize facial expressions. And then, and that started a kind of a movement to start having simulated faces to practice facial expressions. And then in 1997, I did this little thing for WIST. That was basically because, the early PDAs were coming out, the Palm Pilots, and I wanted some quick way of writing on those without just using a little finger or something or just a stylus. So it's called quick writing. You just basically, you can see this is the word the, goes to T and then H and then E, So everything is a really fast little scribble. And I thought it was just really going to be for people who are using PDAs. And I went to the WISC conference, which was in Banff, and people started beaming it back and forth and playing with it. And I thought, okay, we're our nerdy little community. But it turned out that it was because you only have to move a little bit, it ended up being useful for people who have serious neurological problems that lead to say muscle degeneration. So this is George. George is a kid who perfectly intelligent but didn't have any way of writing, and so here he's using quick writing by just nudging a little thing back and forth and just typing out the words he wants. And it's like the beautiful thing is this is just you put something out there and you say it's free, and other people who are much more clued in than you are figure out what to do. So I'm a real big believer in the spirit of Java applets. And actually that happened in our own lab. I was curious I had this crazy idea, I didn't think it could be implemented, it bothered me that 3D displays, lenticular displays, have these little artifacts. Because it skips pixels, so stereoscopic displays. So I thought if you could make a shutter that would move really fast, then basically, and it was synchronized with the red, green, blue refresh, you could make something with no artifacts, and wherever you go, it would just change the width of the, you can actually see the geometry here. The closer you are, the wider the stripes would be. The further you were, the narrower the stripes would be, and everything would move so fast that you wouldn't see it. But the grad students in our lab, they actually built it. They built an architecture, they built all the electronics, they did this thing, they got a really cool paper out of it. And so all I had to do was write a little Java applet, and then put my name at the end as last author. So that's why you become a professor. And then SIGGRAPH 2002, some of you remember, was the first year they had the fast forward, right? How many people here went to the SIGGRAPH 2002 fast forward? So I did an improved noise paper that year, and somebody told me while I was at the conference that they were going to have the fast forward. I think it was 50 seconds or something that first year, and I thought it was the most ridiculous thing in the world. How are you going to present your paper in 50 seconds? There's like no way you can actually explain anything. So I decided just to go completely rogue, and I wrote a rap. And I just did the whole thing as I just did a rap. You know, I said, okay. And one of my grad students, Chris Poltney, he did the kind of beatbox thing like next to me, and he put on the dark glasses because that's his thing. And I think of everything I've ever done in my 42 years at SIGGRAPH on a cultural level, that is the most significant thing, because Ken Perlin got up and just made a fool of himself in front of everyone, and now everyone has permission to do that. So since then, people have done really silly things for the fast forward, and every time they do, I am so proud. And thank you. And many, many years later, I swear, just last year, I had a student who asked me, could you tell us about the rap? I'm sure that student wasn't even born then, so it's so great. So then, you know, other things that we did, we started getting into this whole let's mix the physical and the virtual. It was somehow more exciting to kind of pull into the physical world. So this idea of, I noticed at some point that if you take a tapered kaleidoscope, you can start seeing many, many different directions. And then basically I mentioned this, and I just showed just this much basically to Jeff Hahn, who was in our lab at the time. And so notice that you can use a projector to send light in from different directions, and you can use a little camera to see all the different reflections. And then this was what our lab setup looked like. And then basically what you can do is gather all the data for a BRDF. So you have all the different directions of light going in and all the directions of light going out. You put a sample down there, and here we had a sample of a whole bunch of jelly beans. This is what it looks like inside the kaleidoscope, because you get all these different angles. And then you take all this stuff and you process it, and now you can make a giant table of BRDF from all the different combinations of light going in and light going out. And this creates very, very realistic looking materials. So I learned then you have to work with people who actually know how to physically make things. So I started looking for grad students who know how to physically make things. And so we started doing things like, this was a project where we would just move around little robots on a table. Here we're using it to rearrange furniture. And then there's computer graphics underneath, and also underneath there is a camera that's tracking where they are. So meanwhile, these act like artificially intelligent creatures, and when you rearrange one piece of furniture, it moves all the others to like optimize feng shui. And after sort of getting the project started, my main contribution, again, because I'm more of a software person, was I ended up writing an algorithm to figure out the real-time path planning. But all the heavy engineering work was done by the students because they were into it. They were excited to build something. And then Ilya Rosenberg came to our lab at some point in the late 2000s, and he was kind of fascinated by
pressure sensing. And so he created a pressure imaging device. He now has a successful spin-off company with that, where he would basically say, hey, we can create an anti-alias surface for pressure imaging. And then we kept working on it. We started building large mats. We started using these things with people who have balance disorders. You give them VR, you put them on these mats, you start assessing like where their balance disorders are, and you start giving them training to help them to balance better. So now there's a whole group in the physical therapy department that's using these things. Meanwhile, I discovered 3D printing. And the thing about 3D printing is, if you spend long enough in computer graphics, and you're always looking at things on a screen, and this is really serious, you have no idea how big anything is. It's just the thing on the screen. So I got myself a little 3D printer, and I started printing some of my own things out, and this is how big they were. It's like, wow, it's this big, you know? It's like, it's here. And so I basically started, this has been around since the 1800s, this idea of taking 3D models and putting them in zoetropes. And I think it was a French guy in 1880-something who did it first. And so I did my own version of it. And what you're seeing is actually this sculpture, but then I take a picture and then I move it over and take a picture and move it over. And it was it was my little procedural character stuff and implicit surface modeling and all my little toys, except now I could bring it out into the real world. But I wasn't satisfied, because what was going on here was I was taking a 3D thing and I was adding the dimension of time, and I was making it 4-dimensional. So, time is the 4th dimension and all that. And I thought, well, but we already have a 4th dimension. So maybe I can just push this a little further. So I started with a hypercube, and I said, let's animate a hypercube. So the hypercube is now rotating around 2 dimensions. So it's 4 dimensions projected down to 3, and then we add time, and now it's 5 dimensions. There's absolutely no practical use for this. And it feels great. So I made this on my little 3D printer. 2011, I was invited to give a keynote at SIGGRAPH Asia in Hong Kong. And I wanted to do, and then I thought, this is my opportunity to harken back to some of the childhood stuff that I was interested in. And the Kinect had just come out. So I thought, great, the Kinect had come out, I can move my finger around and it can be tracked in 3D. So I did the presentation such a way, I mounted the Kinect here, and I stood here and I just went like this, and then on the screen behind me things started appearing in the air as though I was drawing, as though I was giving a talk from the future. And I did all that stuff they did in the original Star Wars, with Princess Leia, to make it look like it was all sparkly, and you have the banding coming in that shows you that it must be real because you're getting interference between the camera and the projector. And so I just added all those things in and just gave this talk and kept drawing things. But my goal was really to eventually be able to do that for real. So this was kind of I wasn't really seeing the stuff I was drawing, but I wanted to eventually get to the point where that would become reality. So I was kind of like trying to say, that's where we want to get to. And then over the next few years, I started writing the software to do that for real. I started making it so you could draw things, and the things you drew would come to life. In fact, the presentation tool that I'm using, ChalkTalk, actually does this. I draw things and they come to life. And so when I teach my classes, I can now draw, so if you draw something like, I want to teach the physics of a pendulum, for example, and I'm just drawing this on my trackpad, and it knows what I'm drawing, and like say you want to talk about, okay, so that's a sine function that decays, so you connect that to that, and then when you do this, you start seeing the behavior. And I can do this with all sorts of different objects, and I teach math and computer graphics and all these things by now drawing them, and it gets the students' attention. And in fact, at some point, I started making videos where I use a light pen. And now I really could see it because I was just looking at the screen, and I'm drawing, and all the things I'm drawing explain. So this is a lesson about matrix transformations. So I could actually now start doing lessons where I'm talking to you, and it's like it's the future, except it's not the future. We can do this now. All you need is the webcam to be able to track a light pen. So it's actually very simple. Then in 2014, my hero, John Carmack, convinces the not always too bright mega corporation that he's working for that they should support his project of the Gear VR. And the idea of the Gear VR was, okay, so you take your phone, in that case it was a Samsung Galaxy Note 4, and you have, the two lenses that people have been doing for quite a few years, I think since the 1800s, and you have your IMU, but the problem is 3 degree of freedom VR doesn't really work if you attach an external viewer to a phone, because you can't get access at enough frame rate to really have a low latency compensation. You can have a camera that's sort of looking around and figure where you're going, but your IMU can't keep up because you don't actually get enough samples per second from the internal phone's IMU to be able to predict when a person turns their head where they're going to be looking at the next frame refresh. I know some of you just really know this really well. So his innovation was to say, let's put an extra IMU in the Gear VR itself, in that headset before you put the phone in. So we have complete control. We know exactly what's going on. I can sample 400 times per second, and it was the first 3 degree of freedom VR headset where you didn't get sick and throw up. And it turns out, in marketing terms, people not getting sick and throwing up is really good. I hope you're taking notes. So this was the first time we had access to a inexpensive VR 3 degree of freedom headset. Now, I wasn't interested in a 3 degree of freedom headset, but people don't get sick because they move their head back and forth, because that doesn't change your image really fast. They get sick because they swing their head like this and everything goes behind, and oh, I did it again. I forgot to refresh. I have to keep refreshing, otherwise because the computer's not plugged in. So when I saw this and I realized what we had, my first thought was, you notice this little thing stuck on this, my first thought was to go out and buy an OptiTrack system. Because if you buy an OptiTrack system, then now you can do the position from the OptiTrack, you can use the Gear VR for not getting sick orientation, and you can put your grad students in the same room and they're all seeing each other as avatars in the same place at the same time, and you can start asking questions about co-located VR without people getting sick. So all it took was this innovation of the IMU in the headset external to the phone, and we could start getting started, and then we just started getting all these projects. We did live theater projects, we did projects where people are birds, where people are doing exotic celebrations around the world. We showed up at SIGGRAPH 2015 with what we called HoloJam, which is just invite people into our booth, put them in a VR headset, give them wands, and they all start drawing in the air together. And everybody just started drawing in the air and having a great time. And we started learning what works and what doesn't work socially. And it turns out people really like hanging out together in VR physically when they can see each other. It works incredibly well. And here was, a place back in one of our VR rooms at our lab. So everybody's hanging out in VR. And this is David Lobser was the artist who did the aesthetic work for this. We basically built a Mexican Day of the Dead celebration. Some of the students from Mexico really wanted to see that, and so we followed their lead. In 2017, we had a project where everybody is a bird in a flock of birds, another one where Andy Daffy was the artist for that. Everybody's a robot in a dance party. And it turned out that SIGGRAPH is a very intense place, so people would go into the dance party and dance, like crazy, and then they would go back on the line and come back in again, and they just want to just do it as much as they could. And then apparently it was more important to them than seeing technical papers. And then we asked a different question. We said, okay, this is all fun, but what's the cultural impact of this? So we started from what's the cultural impact? And we said, what do we do next? So here at Vancouver, at SIGGRAPH 2018, we said, how are we going to do something that could potentially impact hundreds of millions of people? So what we did was we said, okay, we're going to simulate an experience of theater, but we're not going to do it online. We're going to have people physically in the same room. They're going to put on headsets. They're going to sit their butts down. They're not dancing around. They're acting like an audience. All we're going to ask of them is to watch and listen to our piece, which will look and feel to them like it's live, even though it's a computer graphic animation. Everybody sees it and hears it from their own perspective. We did spatial audio with the lab of Agnieszka Rosinska at NYU. And then we're going to assess it. We work with a cognitive scientist and his students, Jan Ploss. And basically people come in and they sit down and a story unfolds, and it's magical realism because you can do that in VR, so you can make impossible things happen. But people always have the experience. In fact, we passed by the room. You've seen this room. This is kind of where it was. It's in one of the ballrooms in the I think it's in the Pan Pacific. People, it was really popular. 30 people go at a time. We had several thousand people come through in the course of 4 days. And it was a highly social experience. Here you can see people holding each other's hands, families coming together, because the fact that people were physically there with each other turns out to be a big deal. It's something that we have no idea how to replicate online. That sense of you and me are in the same space in this moment in time, in the same room, having this experience. I mean, in some sense, it's obvious. People go to restaurants, they go to movie theaters, they go to museums together, they go to parks. People want to physically be together. That sense of relief we all are feeling as the pandemic is perhaps loosening its grip is like fundamental to who we are. And then we took the same piece. This is the main character of the piece. It's a coming-of-age story about a young shaman in the dawn of the first media, which is the cave paintings. And then we brought it to the Tribeca Film Festival, where it was seen by another several thousand people. And then we got a generous grant from the education group at what was then called Facebook. And these very, very wonderful people sent us 30 quests. And so I immediately started holding my graphics classes in WebXR. Instead of WebGL, we switched to WebXR and started using quests and started having the students do group projects using basically the same idea that we'd been doing, where they're in the same room, they can see each other's avatars, and they start creating group experiences for each other. And the students loved it, of course, because they can create completely immersive worlds, and it's very, very motivating for programmers. So I haven't shown you everything. For example, is Aaron Hertzman still here? Or did he had to leave at some point? So Aaron Hertzman did awesome work, amazing work, and now he's like doing incredible stuff, but I didn't get time to show his work, his beautiful, painting work. But every one of these students has gone on, these PhD students has gone on to do amazing things, or they're still working with us in the process of doing it. And the thing that I love about this whole academic thing is just as Frank Crow and Jim Blinn and Turner Whitted were generous toward a kid like me, I get to be generous toward these kids, and then they get to go pay it forward and they get to nurture the next generation. And it's so baked into the feeling of what the computer graphics community is that we don't even question that it's a culture of generosity and of giving. And so every one of these students has done brilliant work, and I want you to give them a round of applause. And this is just the PhD students. There's there's hundreds and hundreds of wonderful students in addition. So part 3, as I promised to end, I'm going to talk about the future. So the part 3 is called To Our Children's Children's Children. By the way, has anybody gotten the reference yet? Oh, there you go. I knew there were some true pioneers here. All right. So 2006, I read this book. Has anyone read this book? So Vernor Vinge posits a world some decades in the future where people wake up in the morning and pop in their contact lens. And again, it's a co-located world. We're not talking about everybody being in Ready Player One and, locked into some sort of weird machine and just pretending to be present. We're talking about physical co-presence, but the world is perceptually changed because they're wearing the contact lenses. And VR looks like this right now for the most people, for the most part. you have an experience of VR. I mean, I was out on the floor there, and there was an experience where there was a 10 by 10 thing and another 10 by 10 thing, and two people, one was going like this, another was in the other one going like this, and they had no idea that I kept waiting for them to bump into each other. He said there was drama, you know? And that's not what you want. So when Edison was first doing his experiments with the kinetoscope, he thought this was going to be the industry, and he was wrong. And he would set up entire, arcades where everybody is, but the problem is everyone's having. So this was actually what mattered. What mattered to people was being able to go with their kids or their loved one or their friend and share the experience. When you go out to the movies, you think you're going just to see the movie, but if you think about it a little deeper, you're really going because with your friend or your date or whatever, it's like you kind of want to know what they think. Where do they laugh? When do they clutch your arm? Where do they just like, oh, I don't like that? You're learning about each other. And this doesn't cut it. And frankly, this doesn't cut it. So the difference from this to this is kind of what we want. Because this is who we are. We feed off of that feeling. Back in the cave days, the shaman gets everyone around the campfire, and, the wild animals are out there, but we've got each other, and we develop language because that helps us to form kinship groups. And it is what we are, is social creatures who want to bond together. Now, of course, eventually everyone has to mention this guy. Does anyone know who this guy is? He came up with a law. Gordon Moore, that's right. Gordon Moore came up with a law, and Moore's law, it says, roughly speaking, every decade, things get about 100 times faster every decade. 10 times every 5 years, it's exponential. And for a long time, it's true. Now it's sort of becoming true in different ways. It's fanning out. But we can be sure that the future is going to look really different from the present. And this was a theme I thought that was wonderful in both what Pat and Ed said yesterday, is that you design for that. You don't design for today. And so we may not get to the contact lenses soon, but we will get to the glasses. And let's talk a little about what I mean by let's get to the glasses. Let's just burrow down a little bit. So what is this thing here can draw maybe a few watts of power because it's got this. So there's an entire industry. There's the Snapdragon graphics in here from Qualcomm that are specifically designed for, hey, you only have a few watts. I have to do something with the GPU. Meanwhile, of course, NVIDIA has a whole different industry where I can draw hundreds of watts on the thing I can plug into the wall. And that's a 10-year gap right there. That factor of 100 is a 10-year gap with Moore's law. So you got 100 times more power when you plug something into the wall. Now, today, you can do something by communicating between those two worlds. You can use 5G. And 5G is pretty much Wi-Fi with switching, which means you have 3 gigabits per second. Okay, so 1 or maybe 2 people, maybe 3 people can be getting high-end displays. If you really crank it up, you could do a few more, but there's a limit, which means you still have to have some graphics on your device, and you're kind of limited by the power of that device. And even though you have an NVIDIA processor, you can only get so much stuff down the line. So unless you're the only person in the room, you couldn't serve a room like this and have everybody wear glasses and get information to them. They'd have to be doing their own local processing. But we've got a really smart group at NYU that does wireless research. There's Ted Rappaport, there's Yang Wang, who is the third person? There's like a triumvirate, but I can't remember. He's going to be mad at me later. And they are looking at 6G. And the key with 6G is that 6G is, you keep working over the course of the next decade, let's say from 2022 to roughly 2032 to 2033, and you keep getting better and better at approaching the theoretical limits of millimeter wave. Millimeter wave vibrates at 300 billion cycles per second. So the theoretical limit that you could get is maybe 100 gigabits per second, which is 30 times what we have now. So in 10 years, the prediction is that the whole infrastructure is going to change. So in a room like this, you will basically be serving people at something that starts approaching 100 gigabits per second. And that changes the entire equation, because that means that the thing you're wearing on your face, sure, it has to communicate. It mostly has to receive, fortunately, because receiving is a lot lower power than sending. But the little cameras, that are tracking what your hands are doing and tracking the features in the room and the graphics that you're seeing, so you need a display, and you need cameras, you need microphone, you need speaker, you need an IMU and a 6G transceiver and a battery. But all the real heavy lifting is going to be happening off of your glasses. And that is huge, because that means that you're going to have everybody jump into the future. At that point, you're going to pass the point where there's sufficient bandwidth to serve everybody here in a room, or everybody in a busy street, or everybody pretty much anywhere. And that means that you're going to be wearing something lightweight on your face that's going to have very, very heavy hitting, not just graphics. The graphics are part of it, but also the machine learning. Also what is my gesture of my hand? Whose face is that? What room am I in? What is that object that I'm superimposing the 3D thing on top of? So we're going to be in a world where virtual objects are going to be just normal. The way you don't freak out when you see a projection on the screen here, or when I'm seeing something virtual here, I see something on this. This is just part of my world. And the objects that we will all see from our own perspective with our glasses on the street are just going to be part of the world. The creatures that are going to be responding to us are just going, and their AI that's going to drive their behavior are just going to be normal. And kids, just as kids today have never known a world without this, kids will grow up where it's like, that's just part of reality. People will have conversations and stuff will be floating between them in the air, and they'll just take for granted that stuff is floating between them in the air. There'll be creatures that you could draw with your finger, and you draw them, and because you drew them with your finger, they come to life, and they become part of the world, and maybe they eat your plants. So this is going to be normal, and it's basically going to be Harry Potter meets Harold and the Purple Crayon, except that it's not going to be a fantasy. It's going to be what everybody takes for granted. Kids will grow up in a world and say, of course, you grew up in a world where, of course, we have indoor plumbing. Nobody could have ever lived before indoor plumbing, right? But the people who lived before indoor plumbing didn't know that. They thought they were in modern times. And so that's what's going to happen. So basically, the second to last point that I want to make today is that we're in the age of silent movies today, but talkies are coming. And that leads me back to, I think, a more fundamental point, which is, let's go back. Now that we're talking about limited only by your imagination, let's talk about what would I want as a kid if I were a kid in the future. Let's start going back into, because we're talking about the world that's going to be presented to little kids. So I read a book that influenced me heavily. It came out in 1993, almost 30 years ago. Steven Pinker's book, The Language Instinct. How many people have read The Language Instinct? If you have, you know what I'm talking about. By then, evolutionary linguists, and he's doing a sort of a summary of what they've learned, had already determined, because there was conclusive evidence to determine, that language is actually evolved by little kids, 7 and younger. So this is well known among we're very, very good at many things, but little children are the ones who evolve language features. And in fact, in some sense, when you think about it, that has to be true, because for a language to be learnable, it has to be learnable by a mind that young. Otherwise, it doesn't spread. So once we go into this age where we're in a mixed reality that we take for granted and we don't think about it anymore, and everything is computationally enhanced in a seamless way. If you look at this scene of these little kids talking, they're gesturing, they're looking with their eyes, they have facial expressions, they're gesturing with their hands. They will start to evolve language where when I gesture, stuff happens. There will be visual artifacts from my gestures, and that will start working its way into the culture in a way that we can't predict, because we're not those kids. We're sort of before that generation. So just as we evolved as a species when we evolved written language, and then we evolved again when we evolved things like the web, etc. Each time we change our means of communication, we don't evolve biologically, but we evolve culturally. and we effectively turn into a different kind of civilization. So kids, sometime starting about 10 years from now, are going to be living in a world that is fundamentally, like computer graphics is just their normal reality. And what's important about this is we are actually about to enter the age of computer graphics. We're not there yet. People will look back and say, this was just before, as our friend from NVIDIA said, the Precambrian explosion. And to quote Lance Williams, computer graphics is limited only by your imagination. And I can't think of anything that I could say better than Lance, so I will end there. Thank you.